have now the time to have a panel discussion, so I would like to invite Carmen Lawrence, Haydn Washington, and Richard Dennis, who will be trying to answer some of the questions that might be raised by the audience. So we can begin with a series of questions. Yes, first row, yeah, second. Yeah.
Thank you. Just wondering, in all the talks, the issue of political change came up, and I just wondered to what extent the panel thinks that there's something about electoral democracy, the short electoral cycle, that is actually a problem, and that whether there's need for reform of that system, particularly in the way that corporate interests, especially in the US, but in Australia as well, are able to manipulate it.
Maybe I'll have a go at that. I think that there are a number of problems with our political system quite independently of the issues we're discussing today. But it's clear to me that the short electoral cycle is a problem, at a federal level particularly, and Australia is notable for having such a short 3-year time frame. 4 or 5, if you could put up with some of them for that long, would at least give some chance of implementing change. The problem, I think, however, is not so much the time available, but the structure of our political system, which is two-party system with a quite large group in the Greens, but nonetheless that dynamic still remains adversarial and not really requiring a proper dialogue, except in the Senate occasionally, with the variety of voices represented in our community. So I've moved over time toward a system which is actually proportional. I think a proportional system has a lot to offer us because, as we see in the Senate, you get the variety of voices. We should have the same process in the lower house. And those countries that we see in those graphs on inequality, which are more equal, are ones that have to negotiate political outcomes as a result of having systems that aren't winner takes all. So I think that's a fundamental question. There are lots of other things I could say, including the fact that in unequal societies you get less civic participation, less trust in democracy, less willingness to take part in the political system. So in a sense we have to try and reverse that process before we can get the level of democratic agreement that would see perhaps changes like the ones I've suggested.
Look, I agree. Look, in the US you've got House of Reps elections every 2 years. In the UK, is it 5 or 6? I'm not sure. Well, people didn't like that when Thatcher was around 5. I think it's always interesting and important to talk about structural change in our political processes, but if we look around the world, we see similar problems in countries with quite different systems. So it can't be the main, those structural factors can't be the main thing. However, sticking with the theme of inequality in politics, let's be clear, I mean, less than 1% of Australians work in coal mining, less than 1%. We worry terribly about how would our economy survive if we dug up and sold less coal. Tony Abbott got elected promising to sack 20,000 public servants. Promising, please vote for me and I will sack 20,000 public servants. They're about a third of the way through already. Everyone's very happy about that. So our political debate, I think, is broken. You can't blame the electoral cycle for that alone. I'm all for debate, I'm all for research, and I'm all for politics. But let's be clear, more than 90% of Australians think we should ban junk food advertising during children's viewing hours. 90%. And let me be clear, we will not ban junk food advertising during children's viewing hours. There is bipartisan consensus that we shouldn't. You can get it to 98% if you want. It's not going to change unless we change it. So politics is more interesting and important than popularity. There are plenty of popular things we don't do. There are plenty of unpopular things we do. Our political leaders show leadership in inverted commas all the time. They take us into unpopular wars, they give us unpopular GSTs. Don't tell me politicians don't know how to show leadership. They do. They don't want to show leadership on climate change though.
I will take now 2 more questions in a row, and the speakers be ready to answer. Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, maybe thank you. Largely to Richard Dennis about the macroeconomics of investment in fossil fuels. For example, Australian Institute's done some great research, about $13 billion a year, I think, we pay the fossil fuel industry to pollute. What steps do you see as, and the others on the panel, might be achievable for us to lobby to ensure that the public elects politicians that might think of shifting that money to more fruitful and useful areas like increasing welfare, as we've just heard, and investing in renewable energy, for example?
Following question, please. Yes.
My question's related to a bit what we talked about yesterday with steady state economy and capitalism, and also today with inequality. Someone mentioned Thomas Piketty's recent book, Capital in the 21st Century. One of his insights was that if the rate of return of capital in the long term, which historically has been around 5% or so, remains higher than the growth rate, then you get a broadening or a worsening of inequality, particularly in wealth distribution, but also income distribution. Now, given that we're looking for a low or non-growth economy, and given that historically that rate of return on capital hasn't changed much from 4 or 5%, what are we looking at in terms of what happens to inequality in a world where we mandate no growth, but we still have a capitalist system? Do we just go down the pathway that Piketty talked about, which is taxes on wealth, so you redistribute, or do you have to get rid of the capitalist system that demands a return on capital?
Thank you, panelists, if you can address the questions.
Thanks for the Dorothy Dixer, but I won't take it. I'm talking after lunch. But look, just very quickly to take your question and put it into the inequality frame. Yeah, look, around 13 billion a year. That's the federal government subsidies for fossil fuels. We recently estimated in the last 6 years, $17 million was spent by taxpayers, by state governments, on infrastructure and other support for the mining industry. $17 billion. That'll build you a lot of hospitals. It'll build you a lot of schools. I mean, this is old-fashioned politics. Every billion you waste on one thing is a billion you didn't spend on something else. And my political advice to people who think that's obscene would be, don't argue about whether it should be spent on windmills or solar panels, and get a whole bunch of people who agree it should be spent on anything except that. No, seriously, let's take the money off them first. Let's spend it second. Because $17 billion from state governments who say they're cash constrained, from state governments that say they're broke, from state governments that say they can't afford to do things. Well, the budget papers make it pretty clear that they can. Same. In terms of Piketty, look, there's a day-long conversation, but let's be really clear. Again, let's think politically here. Do we need to start actually taxing the rich again, or do we need to smash capitalism? Well, how about we talk about smashing capitalism while we start taxing the rich? Because we don't have to have an argument to do step one.
Haydn, did you want? Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think those funds that spent on the mining industry, and I had a look recently because I was writing an article for another purpose, at just how bloated that had become. And pulling that money back, first of all, identifying it, and the Australian Institute has done an excellent job of that, identifying how much is spent and for what purpose. Some of it does have joint benefits, but little of it. And then saying, and we will spend this money on X. Treasuries hate that. But hypothecating funds that have been formally spent on a purpose that is not socially desired, identifying a desired social purpose, like, for instance, the education of the less well-off in this community. I was on the Gonski panel, and that's another big story about inequality. So directing funds to desired social purposes is very important, I think. And governments have given that up in favour of a view that it has to all be sort of a pool from which funds are drawn, but people can't identify that. They can't understand then how their funds are being spent. That's the first point I make. The second on taxation and redistribution, these are the critical tools that are available to governments to reduce inequality and to start to shift patterns of consumption, for example, away from private motor vehicles toward public transport, toward forms of consumption that are sustainable in the sense that we've been discussing here, that aren't plundering the planet, and toward investments that are socially designed, like the social policy that supports the less well-off, whether it's an income, guaranteed minimum income, or better policy for young children. So I think the taxation cuts that we've all been encouraged to think are the dividend from growth simply have to be reversed and changed dramatically at the top end. And that includes the corporates who are avoiding something like $21 trillion worth of taxation every year around the globe.
Okay, next set of two questions. One, yes, on the back there, please. And yeah, we continue there.
Thank you. Graham Moxton and a number of other speakers envisage a shorter working week. Now, there's been compelling evidence about the likelihood of some form of a collapse with the economic statistics we know will no longer be.
Can you please get closer to you?
Okay, so the statement is that Graham Moxton and a number of other speakers envisage people working less. Then I went on to say that there's compelling evidence that there's going to be some form of a collapse and that the economic system as we know it will no longer be operating. Now I can envisage at best a coherent group of people living in some sort of a village with a hinterland of a rubbish dump if they're lucky, some arable land. If they have an orchestrated endeavour, may well be able to sustain themselves. Simon spoke to him before. He points out that people will have to relearn how to make even basic implements, such as a hoe to till the soil for growing vegetables. These things can be done, but they're very time-consuming, labour-intensive. Productivity is much less. Part of what the current industrial system does is produces labour-saving devices. So my question is to you, Carmen, how do you envisage the future in terms of the amount of work that people will need to do to sustain living?
Thank you. Carmen, let me take another question, please. David Rosen. Take sets of two so we move on. We can.
This is probably a question to Richard and to Carmen. Given that we're at a university where you have, if you like, a dominant economics establishment, and you also have them out in the business, I'm just curious what from your observation of them, are they essentially cheerleaders for this capitalist system that we've got so much problem with, or are they leaders who are giving out bad philosophy, or is there no real difference between the two? Because are they leaders, or are they just cheerleaders, or genuine leaders in this bad economic policy?
That's a tempting question, but I'll deal with the first one first. I'm not sure about the image of the future that you envisage. I can't see round corners. Let me put it this way. When you ask people to imagine a future, most of us imagine something like what we have today, maybe modified a little, or we imagine an idealised world. And when you ask people to project themselves into the future, the research that's been done in psychology shows that around about 15 years, it goes blank. And that's part of the problem we have in talking about these big global issues that have long-term consequences, that human beings don't think like that. And so it takes people of great imagination and persistence to structure a future, particularly one that might look optimistic rather than pessimistic. We tend to be able to see the problems and identify the downsides. We're not very good at imagining what it might be like to live sustainably, what it might be like to take proper account of other human beings on the planet and the natural world. We actually don't do very well at that. So that's a whole task, I think, for writers and artists and people of a creative bent who really can, if you like, get past that blank wall. But I think one of the important parts of it is reduced working hours. Unequal societies have longer working hours. They work, in some cases, weeks longer, than those in more equal societies. So some countries have already decided to cut down on the working week, or have done so through working agreements and so on. We know that long working hours, insecure jobs, partial work, these things have big effects on human well-being. So for that reason alone, we should argue for reduced working hours, quite apart from the effect on the economy. And this is where you can recruit people who are not signed up to a steady state economy. You can recruit people who care about human well-being and who care about people being exploited in workplaces. So there are a whole lot of potential allies that we don't identify if we focus exclusively on the picture in the long term instead of on the benefits of some of these changes, like reducing congestion in cities, like reducing air pollution and so on. They all have benefits, and they're one at a time human scale interventions. Now, just very quickly on university before I pass to Dennis. I was surprised coming back to universities after 20 years to discover how competitive they were as environments, how much they resembled the marketplace, how little attention was given to broader social questions, how few rewards were delivered to academics for being engaged in community, how much individualism was stressed despite words being said about collaboration, and how much they were in fact a mirror image of the worst of the capitalist system. Now that's a strong observation, and I think it may offend some people, but it does bother me that our institutions, which should be leading the way in thinking about alternative futures, are stuck very firmly, I think in a supine way, right behind the business construction of reality.
It's a tough crowd, Carmen. I agree. I'll come back to that in a sec. Let me first say, look, the Australia Institute runs National Go Home on Time Day in November each year. Civil disobedience with a smile, I called. I have 6 weeks holidays a year, not 4, and most of my staff have 6 or 8 weeks holidays a year. I'm rich enough to buy leisure, and I love leisure more than I love stuff. And I think shorter working hours are fundamental to any form of transition to a sustainable society. But let's be clear, most people feel they can't afford to buy the leisure, and very expensive housing prices are central to keeping people working those long hours. So it's hard. I'm very proud that I buy leisure instead of luxury cars. Not because I hate luxury cars, but because I love leisure. I really do. But that's a choice I can afford to make. And we need more people to be able to afford it. And unless we do something about housing, you won't see many people signing up. But going home on time, I encourage that. November, going on time. As for economics, well, I agree with Carmen. And to put it into perspective, Australian universities now employ American economists to move to Australia to write about the American economy in American journals so that we can improve the status of Australian universities. That's what the pathetic indicator-led version of quality has resulted in my discipline and many disciplines. No one's interested in the Australian economy. So Australian taxpayers fund foreign economists. And I'm xenophobic, I'm just saying, why do Australian taxpayers want to better understand the American economy? Answer, to improve the prestige of our unis. Yeah, right. Talk about pathetic colonialism. But it's worse than that. I would say in the 80s and 90s there was a very important economic debate of which academic economists played an important and arguably destructive part. But let me choose my words carefully. These days they're entirely irrelevant. We're not having an economic debate. There is no economic debate. There are non-economists, be they politicians or chief spin doctors for a lobby group, talking about the economy all the time and telling you what's good for the economy. Almost to a man and woman, none of them are economists. None of them are academic economists except for a handful of exceptions. I see Frank Stilwell smiling there. John Quiggin's a fantastic example. And on the conservative side, there is a handful of economists who participate in public debate. But let me be clear, we no longer have an economic debate in this country. We have vested interests talking about the economy as a cover story for their self-interest. And the academic economists, by and large, are not only irrelevant, but I would say tacitly complicit in their silence. They're too busy trying to publish something about the American economy in an American journal to put their hand up and call bullshit when they hear it.
In terms of the actual question, I think of the working hours, I think that's been answered. That's fine. I might just go back to Don's point where he's talking about what are we going to have to relearn. And one of the reasons we made sure we had an ethics section in the program here is because mostly we don't talk about ethics in regard to economics. The two seem to have been poles apart. But one thing and the reason I made sure we had Holmes Ralston's talk, part of the things we're going to have to relearn in a steady state economy or a sustainable future is also that respect, both within our own society that we've been talking about with the equality, but also respect in how we relate to the rest of the natural world that our ancestors once understood, and we're going to have to relearn that we, in terms of the fact that we belong to our environment and we are residents here on the earth. So that's just an observation I'll make.
So can I just make a quick clarifying statement? My hostility is aimed at the senior academics with tenure who can and should do something about it, and my sympathies are with the young ones who've got absolutely no flexibility, academic freedom or job security.
Thank you. It's 12:45. On the sake of keeping on time, this is a most interesting debate, but just to keep on time and be able to begin this afternoon session, I will stop here the questions. You're most welcome to continue the chit-chat on the side room. Let me please ask to join again on an applause to our presenters.